My pleasure to introduce Tony Pinn. Anthony Pinn is the Director of Research for the Humanist Institute of Humanist Studies at Rice University. He holds a PhD from Harvard University. He's taught at Macalester College, and after that, he became the Agnes Cullen Arnold Professor of Humanities and Professor of Religious Studies at Rice University. He is also the founding director of the Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning at Rice. Tony has received numerous awards and honors, including the Rice University Faculty Award for Excellence in Research, Teaching, and Service, the Unitarian Universalist Humanist Association Humanist of the Year Award. He has an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters from Meadville Lombard Theological School, and he received a grant from the Yale Center for Faith and Culture on Theology of Joy and Good Life, and the Good Life. And he was Humanist of the Year for the Harvard University Humanist Chaplaincy about a decade ago. And also he has received the African American Humanist Award from the Council for Secular Humanism. So in addition to that, he's the author and editor of more than 30 books, including, and I'm just going to mention a few of them, By These Hands, a documentary of African American humanism. African American Humanist Principles, Living and Thinking Like the Children of Nimrod. And then one of my favorites, The End of God Talk, an African American Humanist Theology. And one of my really good favorites is Writing God's Obituary, How a Good Methodist Became a Better Atheist. And on the subject that he's going to be speaking with us today, a very recent book that's become very popular, particularly among humanists in circles, is When Colorblindness Isn't the Answer, Humanism and the Challenge of Race, the subject of which, as I mentioned, he'll be talking about today. It's kind of interesting, if you see the cover of the book, down here in the corner, people tell me there's a check mark in there. I'm partially colorblind. So I couldn't see the check mark. But speaking for, so as one of the grammatical challenges, and an admirer of Tony, it's my pleasure to introduce Tony Pinn. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here with you. Share your sorrow and your loss. The absurdity of our new social arrangements continues to take its toll. And as I was getting off the plane and got the announcements about the murders, what came to mind first for me was some of the thought of one of my favorite writers, Albert Camus. He is my buddy. I think the world of his work. He's given me a way to kind of understand the world. And in one of his texts, he's wrestling with the nature of life. And he's raising the question, is it even possible to live without appeal? That is to say, is it even possible to live in a context in which there isn't a higher authority that makes up for our shortcomings, that gets it right where we get it wrong? And his answer without doubt is yes. And it seems to me the challenge for us is figuring out ways for that yes to be true, for that yes to be meaningful, despite the circumstances. You know, I've not been to Pittsburgh very many times, but I feel a connection. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, so I also understand the importance of steel, when it's important and when it's not. But more than that, so much of my cultural world was shaped by Pittsburgh, and I didn't even know it. In Buffalo, not far from my home, maybe a 20, 30-minute walk, and it was a beautiful walk along green space. So I would take it on occasion during the summers. There's an art museum, the Albright Knox Art Museum. And that museum, although in Buffalo, New York, not one of the large art capitals of the country, it contained pieces by Andy Warhol. I'm a young guy trying to understand this, but there was just something compelling about this work. just deeply compelling about this work. The philosopher of art, Arthur Danto, argues that with pop art, kind of centered around Andy Warhol in a variety of ways, with pop art comes the end of art history. Art history ends with pop art. And for him, that meant the inability to make distinction. What is the distinction between the Brillo box in the gallery and the Brittle box in the grocery store? What is the difference between the can of soup sold as art and the can of soup consumed as fuel? It disrupted the art world. Keep in mind that prior to folks like Andy Warhol, you had people like Jackson Pollock, who argued that art isn't really even about this visual world, that art is the way the subconscious expresses itself. It's about kind of larger oomph. It's about larger meanings than what we see represented on the horizontal plane. For him, art prompts us to think vertically, to think beyond what immediately comes to the senses. Andy Warhol and others flipped the script. They changed this. But it's not simply the end of art history, if you were to ask me. There are also ways in which Andy Warhol raises questions concerning guiding values. Keep in mind the period of time, late 50s, moving through the 60s, a period of deep turmoil, existential turmoil. And he's raising questions about the abiding values for U.S. life. And he does this in large part through an interrogation of the celebrity, right? The celebrity. Raises questions concerning that sort of status. A questioning of underlying sustainable values and the ways in which these values become superseded by celebrity. One's 15 minutes. We know something about that, yeah? 2016 marked the fact that we know something about the appeal of celebrity. We know something about the appeal of celebrity. It would also seem to me that 2016 moving forward marks, if not the death of, the deep damage to democracy. The kind of assumed guiding principles that mark our collective public engagement. Dislike me if you will, but there are guiding principles upon which we agree. Guiding principles upon which we agree. And again, if not dead, it's on life support. My friends in Europe, when they hear me and other U.S. citizens kind of in turmoil over this, they just laugh and remind me that we're joining the club. Right? That for them, it's not so much the death of democracy, but the death of naivete. The assumption that the U.S. is somehow beyond and above the rest, that what has taken place elsewhere within the context of very smart people could never happen here. But it seems to me there are so many ways in which we've traded these values, whatever they are, traded these underlying values in a way that results in not dialogue, but death. Disagreement doesn't prompt rigorous exchange, it prompts bullets. And there are ways in which we can easily connect this to religion, yes? And that's a popular conversation. Without religious traditions, we wouldn't have so much of this mess in the world, right? Without religious traditions, we wouldn't have this mess, whether you're talking about the Crusades or you're talking about fundamentalists in the United States who are all about, deeply committed to, can find theological justifications for all sorts of rabid violence. Without religion, we would not have these issues. And for me, this hits home in a particular type of way. I grew up in the church, and the church had significance for me in Buffalo. I spent my first 25 years in the church, not simply a member, but a minister. And for me, the church was a second family. What I did not get at home, particularly after my parents' divorce, I got in church. It was a place where I could catch my breath. I didn't have to explain to anyone why I didn't trust police officers, why they were not my friends, and I'd rather not see them. I didn't have to explain why I found the classroom frustrating. Frustrating because there was an underlying assumption that I started with an F and had to prove I deserved better, when some in the classroom who did not look like me started with an A and had to prove they did not merit that. There were shifts and changes in the classroom that were subtle, but not so subtle I wasn't aware of them. And I could go in this environment, and in this environment, I was understood as important, having a deep value and worth. But it was also, I get it, it was also an environment in which otherness was key. It wasn't simply theologically justified, it was theologically required. Us and them. Those who are saved, those who aren't. And in this early environment, those who weren't saved could be treated in a variety of ways, and it was justifiable because they were going to hell anyway. Right? So in my church, we could be homophobic and still assume we were righteous. We could be sexist and still assume we were righteous. Why? Because it's not us. The Bible says so. Bible we didn't really read from cover to cover, but the Bible says so. So it was justified. I get that. It was problematic. My mother initially moved us from a Baptist church in Lackawanna near Bethlehem Steel into an independent church turned Methodist church in the city, not far from our home, because she didn't want us in an environment in which women, simply because they were women, couldn't exercise leadership. She wanted us to think differently about gender. So we moved to this other church, and it had its own set of problems. But I was committed to ministry. I was growing in ministry, right? And for reasons that weren't quite certain to me, I'll tell you why. At this church, I was still fairly young, and it was fairly small, so the minister in charge was also my Sunday school teacher. And he went around one Sunday, and he asked, a typical question. What do you want to be when you grow up? Right? I mean, it's a safe question. This is the question you ask. And we went around the room. We're in a circle, and we go around the room, and you hear the typical kind of responses. I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to be a firefighter. And he got to me, and I said, I'm going to be a preacher. I don't know why I said that. There were ministers in my family line, but no one I actually knew. I just heard about this great uncle or who was involved in me. I didn't know anyone, but it wasn't quite clear to me why I said it, but perhaps because ministers had a certain type of social status. They held a certain type of importance. They spoke and people listened. It was a way of mattering, and it was a way of mattering that was easily available to someone who was, okay, didn't get in much trouble, wore glasses, seemed to be somewhat intelligent, could put a sentence together, you're going to be a minister. And so I embraced it, and his response was, okay, we start next week. So childhood was over at that point. I couldn't play my favorite games anymore, and John, one of my favorite games was you take the hymnal and you just open it up and you point. And you're mindful of that hymn it lands on. And then you close it up again and you open it up and you point again. And you win if you land on the same hymn. That was one of my favorite games. I played that between naps, but that was over with. Now I was in the pulpit. I transitioned from just being a kid to having religious authority. I couldn't go to the store alone, but I'm opening the doors of the church. And if you're unfamiliar with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, that's a big deal because you're inviting people to the front, to acknowledge their sins and accept Christ and become part of this church. This is a big deal on a variety of levels. It's a big deal on a spiritual level, but it's a big deal on an economic level because members are to give 1/10 of their income. Right? So this was major. I led the prayers. I couldn't go to the store alone. Had to be in the house when the street lights came on. But I had this spiritual role, and it felt good. I'd always occupied time and space, right? We all do, but my occupation of this time and space was given a certain type of legitimacy, a certain type of importance that was transhistorical, and this felt good, so I went with it. Before I could vote, I was ordained and decided, in part because of my family prompting, my grandmother told me, look, I'm all with you being a minister, but understand this. I would not go to a doctor without an MD. I would not secure the services of an attorney without a JD. And my grandson will not be an ill-equipped minister. School. But this was family. Right? One of my sisters was in nursing school. I had a brother who was in college, decided with one semester left, it wasn't for him. That's another story. And another sister who was working on a PhD who taught herself Greek and Latin because she thought it would be helpful with her work. Right, so education was understood. When I was really small, my mother went back and got her college degree, took me to classes with her. Education was big. I understood this. And I decided I had to get out of Buffalo for school. I didn't really ever feel comfortable in Buffalo. And no disrespect to Buffalo. It was a city trying to make do with what was available to it. But I lived within the context of friends and neighbors who didn't have the kind of ambition I thought we ought to have. There were ways in which it felt the city could easily beat me down. And I didn't want that. I had to get away. And the minister at that church at the time was being moved. He was going to a large church in Brooklyn. I said, okay, I've gotten into Columbia, I'm going. And I'm the youth minister at this church, and I'm taking classes, and I'm encountering people who, get this, didn't give a damn about the Bible. And they said it with great pride. I'm like, do you understand what you're saying? Do you understand the consequences of that attitude? And they didn't care. And others who embraced traditions that were just completely foreign to me. What is the Nation of Islam? What is Santeria? What is Yoruba practice? And they were fine with it. I'm thinking, but you're going to hell. And they were cool. But this is the thing that really freaked me out about this situation. They often treated me with more integrity and more kindness than the people in my church. And that just freaked me out. And I'm working in this church in Bedford-Stuyvesant. This was Bedford-Stuyvesant 1982, not Bedford-Stuyvesant 2018. Very different location, right? Being destroyed by crack cocaine. So I'm encountering young kids that I'm working with, right? And my thing is, look, we have to have after-school programs. Education really matters. We have to have after-school programs. And one of the things I would do is I'd tell them, look, sit and you write for 15 minutes. I don't really care what you write about, but for 15 minutes you have to write. And my thing was, look, you've got to learn how to harness your ideas, that you can create worlds with words. You've got to harness your ideas. And I was just shocked because too many of them had an easier time describing their demise than thinking about a bright future. Some of them would write eulogies for themselves. 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. And the religion I had, the theology I peddled, offered nothing. They're doing this in the basement of the church. Offered nothing. And this was becoming a difficulty for me. And I'm rethinking my understanding of God. I'm rethinking my understanding of faith to try to accommodate these circumstances. I moved from a God who is all-powerful, who breaks into human history and makes things happen, to what my grandmother described as that small, still voice trying to persuade to the good. It still didn't make a difference. Still committed to ministry, but my ministry is changing. I was not going to be Billy Graham. I was going to be Adam Clayton Powell Jr. I was going to be about the business of transforming lives. It doesn't really matter if salvation is real. It really doesn't matter if Jesus was a historical figure. The key is the kind of moral and ethical vision that was set out. I was going to transform lives. No more preaching salvation. Preach jobs and social transformation. But I had to get out of New York because the people at the church had certain expectations of me, and I needed a space to think. I needed a space in which I could just catch my breath, be theologically vulnerable, and say, I just don't know. So I couldn't go to Union Theological Seminary in New York where James Cone, he was the father of black theology. I was reading him, understanding him, but I couldn't be there. It was too close to Brooklyn. So I decided I'd go somewhere where church ministry really didn't matter much, right? It was about ideas, not really church ministry. So I went to Harvard Divinity School. And I worked at a church in Roxbury where there were similar problems. Across the street from this church, there was a playground, and you would think this is a playground where the name means everything, play. On this ground, no. This was a location for drug deals, prostitution, violence. And I'd ask the minister, Doc, what do we do? And he would tell me, when you preach, T, let the people get happy with you. Get happy about what? Their children were literally dying and I had nothing to say. So it reached a point for me, I had to make a decision. I could be true to this tradition and safeguard it, or I could be about people. And being about people meant leaving. So I contacted the minister, I contacted my bishop, and I surrendered ordination and said, this is not for me. And it wasn't just a matter of leaving the Methodist Church. For me, it was theism does not work. So I left it. I was no longer a theist. Still interested in the study of religion, but no longer a theist. It took a while to rename myself, but with time it became clear to me that I was a humanist. And you might think that's the end of the story, but so much of the turmoil wasn't ended with that. Right? Because I encountered folks who did not believe in God, but were extremely racist, extremely sexist. And it became clear to me, hell, you don't need God to hate people. You really don't need God to hate people. Now, divine justifications give a kind of trans-historical authority for the hatred, but social Darwinism can do the trick. And so I was determined that I was going to find a path, that I was going to make certain that humanism, one, acknowledged and appreciated the contributions that people of African descent had made. I was tired of the assumption that humanism was new to black folks. It wasn't until kind, white Unitarians and others decided that they would share this information with us that we encountered this. I was tired of that. And so for me, it was about tracing the history of this sort of skepticism, free thought, humanism within African American communities, not limited to someone like W.E.B. Du Bois, but certainly celebrating him. Not limited to Zora Neale Hurston, who talks about religion but argues prayer is for the weak-minded. Do this thing yourself. Including Richard Wright, but not limited to him. Including James Baldwin, but not limited to him. And I don't mean the James Baldwin up to the age of 12 who's a Pentecostal minister. I mean the James Baldwin who leaves the church and argues. I mean A. Philip Randolph, but not limited to A. Philip Randolph. I mean Bayard Rustin, the unsung genius behind so much of Martin Luther King Jr.'s thinking, who doesn't receive the attention he deserves not only because of his sexuality, but because of his atheism. Bringing these to our attention and urging humanist communities to recognize that this material has been available and of use to an expansive community. Second step for me was this, and the second step became extremely important because of the questions I would get at humanist gatherings. over and over and over again. Sometimes I was at the same gathering year after year, but the questions did not change. And I thought, well, maybe I'm just not loud enough, right? Maybe pound a little bit and people get, but the same questions over and over again. And it seemed to me that humanists were all about critical thinking when it came to issues other than social justice. That I did not encounter humanists who were not thrown and appalled by people who didn't have a basic scientific knowledge. Read a book. But when it came to issues of race, they'd say, I just don't know. That's the start of a conversation, friend. That's not the end of it. And I found it appalling that someone of my age, a white humanist of my age, would think that ignorance was a justification for not picking up a book and learning something, or assuming that the few blacks they encountered were obligated and responsible for teaching them. We're better than that, friends. That's just laziness, and we're better than that, right? So, but I'm encountering this, and I'm encountering questions like, black people are so religious, let the church worry about them. Yeah? Why do we have to worry about social justice for people who are so committed to an organization that is all about destruction? Yeah? Why do we have to worry about those folks? And anyway, Tony, why are so many black people in the church anyway? You might think on the face of it, that's a really good question. But it seems to me it really hides the important question. For us humanists and atheists and free thinkers and skeptics, the better question is this: why hasn't our movement been more appealing? Why hasn't it been more appealing? And I say this because black people join churches and remain in churches for a variety of reasons, and not all of those reasons revolve around spiritual enlightenment, right? Not all of those reasons involve a hallelujah moment. Think about it this way. Let's just take one example. 1960s, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., churches in the United States begin to decline, that includes black churches. Numerically, they begin to decline. You can't really tell based upon denominational official numbers because they're not removing people from the roll. Now, I know this because I was in ministry. Don't remove people from the roll. And there are good reasons for them not to do that, right? They want to give the illusion of numbers, of strength, even if it costs them a lot of money. One example, within the African Methodist Episcopal Church, your denominational assessment is based upon your membership. Now, if you've got 200 members and you're claiming 400, your 200 members are paying the cost of 400. But the minister looks good because that's a 400-member congregation. We'll just have your tithe and the special building fund and the ooh, we're in trouble fund. And right, so the numbers were off. These churches are beginning to decline. There are other ways in which African Americans are expressing themselves and thinking about the nature of meaning, wrestling with who, what, when, where, and why they are that don't require sitting in that church. And hey, the civil rights movement didn't secure everything we were interested in, but it opened up a door and folks were told, look, speak properly, go to the right schools, live in the right neighborhoods, have the right friends, and the American dream can be yours. 1980s come, and African Americans, lots of African Americans are disillusioned. They played by the rules. They moved to neighborhoods where they were not the dominant population. They spoke English in a particular way. They got the right jobs, went to the right schools, although they heard over and over again, you really don't belong here. They went to the right schools, but yet racism remained real, and they had surrendered so much. A big piece of themselves they had left behind in order to get the American dream the way they had been told it could be achieved. And many of these folks began moving back into black churches, not because they were sick of soul and seeking salvation, but social networking, cultural connections, an opportunity to be in a space and not have to explain why you're angry. Right? To be in a space and not have to worry about code switching. You know what I mean? Yeah. Not have to worry about codes. Just be yourself, do your thing. And if the sermon is the price you pay for that, okay, whatever. Right? So one, we get it wrong. We assume that all black folks are in churches for the same reason. No, we also assume that churches have done absolutely nothing to safeguard black life. From the very beginning of churches, if that is the thinking, you can't explain someone like Denmark Vesey or Gabriel Prosser or Harriet Tubman or Sojourner Truth or Ida B. Wells. You can't explain these figures by saying black churches have done absolutely nothing. A Martin Luther King Jr. You can't explain these figures by saying black churches have done absolutely nothing. What you can say is the cost of that limited advancement isn't worth it. But the question is, why hasn't humanism been more appealing? And I want to venture to say it's because humanism has not dealt with its implicit bias, its racism. That often we don't even want to acknowledge it. But it seems to me, for example, as soon as we claim Thomas Jefferson, we have invited into our thinking, our doing, and our being sexual violence and racism. And so it seems to me it's not that humanism isn't prone to poor thinking. It's we have a way of correcting it because none of this is by divine decree. We operate based upon human ingenuity, human capacity that can be altered, that can be challenged, that can be corrected. It's not the Bible says. It's we said, and oops, my bad, we got it wrong. I just want to say just a couple of other things and then let's chat for a bit, yeah? One, I think what we have to do is come to grips with the nature of privilege and stop assuming that privilege is simply code for economics. Now, we're not simply talking about class. We understand that there are poor white people. We understand this. We get this, yeah? So we're not simply talking about economics. By privilege, we mean an assumed right to occupy time and space, an assumption that any of the benefits of collective life available are available to me. Simple ways in which this operate. It's being able to go into a restaurant, be seated by the bathroom, not assume it's because of how you look. It's going to the car dealership, picking out your car based simply on your wallet and not the kind of attention that car is going to get you. It's the ability to walk down the street or enter an elevator and not have people get off or clutch. This morning in the hotel, it was a pause, and I guess I better get on. You know, there are certain ways in which space gets occupied that are considered justified, and this isn't available to all. So it seems to me it's a matter of recognizing how privilege operates, noting that, and doing what we can to counter it. And one of the ways in which we counter it is by naming it. Right? And it's also a matter of not assuming that the experience of the dominant population is the experience of all. And I'll give you an example. That it would be a huge mistake for me to do this again. A friend of mine, she lives in Houston as well. And we live in roughly the same area. And she was saying, you know, the bayou is beautiful, but, you know, I don't know about walking around there as the sun is going down. And my gut response, and I was stupid enough to say this out loud and even stupider to be thinking it, was, yeah, I'm not certain what you're talking about. I walk the bayou and I feel fine. What is that? Right, the failure to recognize that I'm walking the bayou in a body that is coded a particular type of way, and that this male gender assumes a certain right to occupy time and space. This is mine. And my assumption was it's legitimate to read anyone's experience through my understanding of my own embodiment. Problem. Wrong. And I'll leave you with this thought, and then we'll chat. I understand this can be uncomfortable work, really uncomfortable work. At times it may sadden us, may piss us off. It's uncomfortable, to say the least. And my attitude is this: when it feels uncomfortable, you're doing it right. If it feels uncomfortable, you're doing it right. We're rendering ourselves vulnerable in a way that allows us to recognize our shortcomings. And if we can recognize our shortcomings, we have half a chance of doing something about them. Finally, we're not talking about fixing this overnight. We're talking about dilemmas that are embedded in the very nature of life in the United States, right? That this is deeply American. So I'm not talking about ending this overnight, that this is a matter of perpetual rebellion. It's a matter of recognizing the injustice and continuing to strike against it, recognizing that no one single blow is going to alter all of this. And so I leave you with the words of my buddy Albert Camus. When he thinks about Sisyphus rolling that rock up the hill as punishment, knowing that it's only going to come down and dude's got to roll it up again, it's only going to come down, he's got to roll it up again, his response is, one must imagine Sisyphus happy, content not in the outcome but the doing. Thank you.